Now, I'm going to use the biblical process, the sanctuary and the feast, to show you the process that God is putting his people through. And of course, if you're not familiar with the feast, it's Leviticus chapter 23. It starts with the Feast of Unleavened Bread and Passover, which is, of course, this is Easter weekend coming. And then after Passover is the first fruits, day after the Sabbath. And then 7 weeks from the waving of the first fruits is Pentecost. Then you have the 3.5 months of summer drought, and then you have Feast of Trumpets, and then the Day of Atonement, and then the Feast of Tabernacles. And so you're going to see this process through in Daniel chapter 1 weaved into the text, because this is the process of God's salvation. And this process that God's people go through is supposed to bring them to salvation, right? Verse 3 says, the king spoke to Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring in certain of the children of Israel, of the king's seed and of the princes. So there's a 3-part description here. I don't need to go apart the 3 parts, the eternal gospel, 3 parts of the kingdom. Mm-hmm. So there's a Passover here, because the Passover is when the angel of destruction comes in Egypt, right? Some people live and some people die. The same thing happens in Jerusalem. The king of the north comes in and conquers Jerusalem. There's a Passover experience. Some people are going to live and some people are not going to live. It's literally a Passover. But you'll notice now that there's a choosing of specific people to be part of the first fruits, or part of the people that are taken into captivity. Of course, Jerusalem is going to fall 3 times. And so this literally is the first fruits going to Babylon. Babylon will conquer again, and then there'll be more people that go. And then finally in 586, it'll be conquered the 3rd time. And then the majority of anybody who's anybody goes, and there's only very few people left. So this is literally the first fruits of captivity of God's people going to Babylon. And so it's going to describe them, verse 4, children. Interesting, the king of the north knows to target children. If he can get the children and he can indoctrinate their thinking and change their philosophical suppositions and the way that they view reality based on his philosophical suppositions, then he wins the battle, right? So it's interesting, verse 4, it says children. And so there's a 7-part description here. Children, in whom is no blemish, well-favored, skillful in all wisdom, cunning in knowledge, understanding science, such as had the ability to stand in the king's palace. So he's choosing the brightest and the wisest, the best. Actually, it sounds like Leviticus when you look at the sacrifices that were to be offered. They were to be without blemish. They were to be the best, right? And so actually that's a type of Christ. So the king of the north, the people of this world are wiser than the people of the light. They know to teach the children and to train the children. So they have a specific group of children that they're taking, and they have to be children of Israel, have to be of the king's seed, and they have to be princes. That's the 3 descriptions. So they're targeting the children. Of course, Daniel and Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are part of this group. Now it tells you right in front, it says the number 7 of the description, which is verse 4, it says that they have ability to stand in the king's palace, and they're to teach them the learning and the language of the Chaldeans. So the whole idea is then, again, to indoctrinate these children. If you can capture the children and indoctrinate them, then you have the next generation, right? And that's what we're also seeing that being played out in our world right in front of us. So we already talked about the economic stuff that's going on. This thing of trying to capture the children's minds has been going on for a while. By the way, that's why most of our churches are full of a bunch of old people with white hair, and there's no children left in them, because the children have been indoctrinated and swept away by secular humanist philosophies and all this other garbage that has been fed into their minds. And so they don't see any need for God or for religion. They don't even believe there is a God or whatever. So you can see, it's amazing. You can see the end here in Daniel 1. You can see the same end happening right around us. So verse 5, it says that the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat. Now, it's very important. The king supplies everything in the kingdom, right? So the king supplies them their daily provisions. And by the way, the word daily is connected to what the king supplies. We'll see later the removing of the daily, and this daily will become a big issue, and people are going to have all kinds of discussions about what is the daily in Daniel chapter 8 that's removed. And well, here it just tells you simply what the daily is. The daily is the daily provision the king gives you so you can have life, right? And of course, everything that is provided to the subjects in the kingdom comes from the king. Remember, when we get to Daniel chapter 4, the king is described as a tree, and everything, all the animals and all the beasts and all the birds and they get life from the tree. So the tree is the tree of life. It's a symbol of the king, and he gives life to all the subjects of his kingdom. Well, it's the same here in Daniel chapter 1. Of course, if you think of the Lord's Prayer, give us this day, you're praying to God, give us this day our daily bread, right? So you're praying to God as your king, and because he's your king, then he's the source of your life. Everything you get comes from him. Well, this is the same idea that the ancients had of their king. So the king appoints them the daily provision of their food and of their wine, which he drank. And by the way, the word king meat just means food. So it's not specifically vegetarian. It actually describes all food, right? And the wine which they drank. And the plan here is given in verse 5. So to nourish them for 3 years, so that at the end thereof they might stand before the king. So that's the second time. So they're chosen purposely because they have the ability to stand before the king. They're going to be nourished and they're going to be trained for 3 years. And the goal is that they will stand so they can stand before the king. So that's the whole purpose, is to stand before the king. Standing means that you are able you have the ability to function responsibly in the presence of the king. That's where the word, again, I've told you before, we use the word understand, comes from standing under the pressure. You're standing under the responsibility. So if you're standing under that responsibility, you're standing under your king, that means you're acting responsibly in the situation that you're given, and you're able to function responsibly so you can stand. Otherwise, you're going to fall, which means you can't, right? And by the way, this is what God is trying to train us to, right? That's why he allows his children to go into captivity, because they need to stop being babies and crawling around. They need to learn to walk and then to stand. So very interesting here, again, these concepts. So verse 6, among them were the children of Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And of course, they have Hebrew names here. And those Hebrew names reflect the character or attributes of God. Of course, Daniel means God is judge. Hananiah means dedicated to God. Mishael actually comes from Michael, who is like God. And then Azariah is God has helped, or God is your protector. But the prince of the eunuchs, verse 7, is going to give them new names. And he's going to give them the names of the Babylonian gods, right? So to Daniel, he gives the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. So they give them new names. Of course, we have an idea of what that means, right? In the gospel, the same idea. Abram becomes Abraham. Saul becomes Paul. Simon becomes Peter. So the change of the name is supposed to be the idea of a new personhood, a new being born again, a new mindset. So the ancients understood this very well. So what they were taking them out of what was familiar, bringing them to a new world. They're going to teach them a new language. They're going to give them a new philosophy. They're going to give them a new name. They're going to make them a new creation, a new creature, and they're supposed to reflect the glory of Nebuchadnezzar and the whole worldly idea. This is, of course, we'll talk about the transferring of kingdom probably next week. But in verse 8, it says, Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself. So Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah actually purpose in their heart that they're not going to, they're going to conform to their captives as much as reasonably is responsible, but they're not going to give up their dedication to God. They're not going to give up their mind and their hearts from God. Actually, they learned this from the education that Josiah gave them, right? The law of God was actually taught them, and it was written on their heart. And so it's okay. Nebuchadnezzar can do anything he can to change the outside, but they're not going to allow him to change what's going on the inside. And this is where the food test becomes an issue, because the food is something that goes on in me. And so, I'll march to your drum because I have to on the out for superficial things. But when it comes to my relationship and my responsibility to God, I'm not giving in, right? And so that's part of the test that goes on here for God's people. So it says that they would not defile themselves with a portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. So therefore he makes a request of the prince of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. So then it describes that God had brought Daniel in favor with tender love with the prince of the eunuchs. And the prince of the eunuchs said unto Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who hath appointed your meat and your drink, for why should we see your faces worse than liking than the children which are of your sort? Then you shall make me endanger my head to the king, which it explains to you the principles by which Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom functions, right? It's by fear and coercion, the fear of death. By the way, there's a couple of you here, we've been over this, but it's interesting that the prince of the eunuchs is mentioned. It's mentioned 6 times, and the 7th time, the 6 times he's called the prince of the eunuchs, and then the 1 time he's called the master of the eunuchs. So he's mentioned 7 times. So there's something interesting here going on with the prince of the eunuchs, which is very interesting. Because sometimes you look at Daniel 1 from the perspective that Nebuchadnezzar actually symbolizes Satan's kingdom and pushing the Babylonian ideas, but there's the other aspect of Nebuchadnezzar is that he's actually a servant of God, and his kingdom becomes a symbol of God's kingdom, which then makes the prince of the eunuchs a very interesting character. If Nebuchadnezzar comes to symbolize God's kingdom, being mentioned 7 times, there's some food for thought there. I think there's something more obviously going on with that than we have seen in the past. Maybe some of you will get some ideas and see some pictures fall together. But so the point here is that there's a small test. So Daniel comes up with a small test. He says, verse 12, prove your servants, I beseech ye 10 days. Let them give us pulse to eat and water to drink. Then let our countenances be looked upon before you, and the countenance of the children of eat the portion of the king's meat, and what you see, then deal with your servants. So Daniel has a simple, reasonable request of 10 days test, and then he's given that it's consented to. So he consented to them, verse 14, this matter, and proved them 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, their countenance appeared fair, and fatter in flesh, and all the children wished to eat the king's meat. So Melzar took away the portion of the meat they gave, and the wine they should drink, and gave them pulse. So the idea here again is that the small test prepares them for the bigger test, and you'll see the small test is connected to the number 10 days, the same as the greater test at the end. They're going to be found 10 times wiser. So this is the challenge for God's people in captivity. If we're faithful in the little things, then we will be ruler over the greater things. But if we are not faithful in the little things, we will not pass the bigger test. And you can lie to yourself all you want about how when the mark of the beast comes and they tell you have to bow down to the mark of the beast, how you're not going to go to church on Sunday or whatever you think is going to go on in your head, that you're not going to cave into the big test. But you can't overcome the little things of your character, the little things that God is testing you on. Then you're just lying to yourself. If you cannot pass the little test, you will not pass the big test. And this is this is why God gives the little test, right? He gives us a little test so we can see the areas that we're weak or that we fail, and then he gives us time. So that time that he gives us, that 3.5 years of time, is a wilderness experience that God gives us to see the areas that we need to grow, and then to call upon his name and allow God to restore and recreate and to fix our broken machinery so that we are able to stand. And so if we ignore what God is showing us in the little test, we say, oh, well, that doesn't matter. That's just a little thing. Oh, that doesn't matter. That's a little thing. If we ignore those little things, we will never stand the big test. We can see the big test. will be defeated long before the big test comes. And that's the point. Now, I know as Adventists, we focus on the whole idea of not eating meat and vegetarian diet and all this other, and then that's true. There's, obviously what you eat is important, but it is so much more than just what you're eating. It deals with your mind, the way you think. It deals with your character. It deals with, all the little character flaws and little temptations that so easily defeat us that the Bible keeps talking about. Actually, it's the lust of the flesh that we are supposed to be overcoming. And whatever that lust of the flesh, as the New Testament talks about, that you see that area of weakness, that's where you're supposed to be calling upon God and asking him to restore you so that you're no longer a slave to your flesh and that you can make choices based on principles that are right rather than what feels good or what your flesh desires. And if you're not growing to that 3.5 time period, then you're not going to be ready for the test that comes at the end. And when we talk about time prophecy, we think of the times and half a time, or the 3.5 times, the 42 months. We usually see those things and we start counting days. But those time prophecies, that 1260 year time prophecy or day prophecy actually describes a wilderness experience. So it doesn't matter if you're Jesus and you're 40 days in the wilderness, or if you're in the dark ages since 1260 years. The point is the wilderness experience is always a time when you go through the process of your flesh being tested, and you're seeing the areas in your life that you're weak, and then you call upon God for him to restore your mind so that your flesh does not have control over your mind and your will to have you cave into things that you're subject to. And so the 3.5 times, the 1260 days of 42 months are always a wilderness growth experience. And it's an experience that's not based on a number of days. Jesus isn't sitting in the wilderness saying, well, I've been not eating for 20 days, only got 20 days left and then I'm done. No, Jesus isn't counting days when he's in the wilderness. Jesus is wrestling in his heart and wrestling with his flesh to be faithful to God, right? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. So this is something, I think there's a danger. There's a lot of people out there looking at time prophecies and trying to count days. But the focus of counting a day takes your attention off of what God is trying to teach you, which is God's trying to show you yourself, the thoughts and motives of your own heart. He's trying to show you the weakness of your flesh. He's trying to get you to grow up so that you're not a baby that's subject to the winds and the cares of this world, and that you can stand. And so the wilderness experience, again, the time becomes a symbol of the experience. The experience is what is important.
Do you know how many times that I have heard? I mean, I was listening to Lee Venden. I turn on our radio station. I listen to other speakers, and they're all talking about a daily walk. They're all talking about what matters is what you do today.
Right.
I mean, they're saying the same thing that you just said.
Praise God. And that's why they use the word daily, right?
Mm-hmm.
Daily.
Yeah. And it isn't, you can't put it off.
Well, to miss is to miss everything.
Right.
For people that are watching this, Pastor Tim, that don't know, would you explain what pulse is?
Pulse. Yeah. Pulse is, it's vegetable seeds. It's natural foods. It's not, it's not meat. It's just a plant-based diet is basically what pulse is.
Okay.
Right. So they drink pulse and water instead of the king's food and his wine. Of course, there's a connection to the wine of Babylon here, obviously, that Revelation will pick up as well. So
I was thinking about that the other day with their test of just having the pulse and deciding that's what they want to do. Can you imagine, though, that there was other Hebrews there that said, look, you're endangering our life. For the common good, you need to just go along and be quiet. Take what the king is giving you. You're going to insult the king and you're going to embarrass us. So, it wasn't just about choosing, the right diet. It was far beyond that in the character with the development that they were having to gut to in order to make that type of decision.
That's right.
I hear you saying standing up to peer pressure.
Yeah.
That's right. Standing against the popular to stand for what is truth.
Yeah.
Right? That's right. And by the way, that's what all these tests are always connected to all these different areas, right? It's never just one area of growth.
Right.
So do you think that there were more than just those 4?
There probably was. Obviously, everyone that was brought into captivity was supposed to be wrestling through the process, right?
Right.
So I think Daniel is purposely choosing the 3 for a purpose, as
Right.
you when the fiery furnace, there's kingdom principles and dynamics being explained.
Right.
Could they be symbols of more that were faithful? Probably. But of course, that's conjecture. We're just
Right.
supposing, but I mean, we'd certainly like to think that there was more than just 3 or 4 faithful. But of course, when you look at the flood and you look at Sodom and Gomorrah, there's not usually a whole lot that are faithful.
No,
So
they weren't, were there?
the numbers are usually a lot less than we would like to think. And I'm sadly afraid that that same thing's going to happen when the test comes to us. There's going to be a lot less people that are faithful than we would like to think. But anyway. So verse 17 says, as for these 4 children, notice how God blesses them. By the way, we talked about Passover and we talked about the first fruits. And this brings us, because of the small test, this brings us to Pentecost, verse 17. As for these 4 children, God gave them knowledge and skill in all learning and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in visions and dreams. So notice, God is giving them the knowledge and the understanding of visions and dreams. God is giving them the understanding of his word and what the issues are. God is giving them the understanding of the conflict and what Satan and his kingdom is trying to do. And God has given them the wisdom and understanding of what God is trying to do, so that they can choose to which kingdom they're going to put their allegiance, which side of the battle they're going to be on. And by the way, that's part of the great light that God shines, because God is asking everyone on this planet to make a decision to which kingdom they belong. Therefore, God has to shine light into the principles of both of those kingdoms, so that people can clearly make an intelligent choice. God isn't trying to deceive us or play games with us or trick us. God is being upfront with us. So God is going to supply the wisdom and understanding of what's happening so that people can make choices. And I believe that's what he's doing. I think that there's abundance of light shining from his word on what's going on in our world and what should be going on in us, so that people can choose. So this is your Pentecost experience if you're going through the feast. And that brings you to the end of the spring, right? And then there's going to be, now you're going to have your 3.5 months of summer drought if you're in the feast system. So you'll notice at the end of verse 17 ends the scenario of the small test. And then verse 18 takes you now the 3 years later, the end of the 3 years. So you have this gap between 17 and 18, which is actually your summer growing process. And the idea here is that Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are growers, and they spend those 3 years growing. That's what they're doing in the wilderness. By the way, that's what all of us are supposed to be doing in the wilderness, is growing. That's the purpose of the wilderness. And when you're ready to be called out of the wilderness for your next test, then that's when God will call you when you're ready. And whether it's 40 days or for your Moses, it's 40 years, whatever it happens to be, God, by preparing for what God is showing me today, I'm growing to be ready to stand for what he wants me to do tomorrow. And if you're always looking for the tomorrow to do it, but you're not growing today, that tomorrow will never come.